All right, welcome back. Now we're going to talk about perception in yourself. So first, let's talk about the self-concept defined. That is the notion of your self-image and your self-esteem kind of combined together. That is your self-concept. How you see yourself, how you feel about yourself, all those things all fall into your self-concept. Now, the book talks about when you go and have a conversation and there's two of you in the room, you're having a didactic conversation and you're talking to one or another person. Barnland came up with a theory, they call it the six-person theory, or six-person concept, and that's where there's actually more than one person involved in the communication, even though it's there. It's more the perceptual thing than the actual people. So the first one they start talking about, there, like I said, there's six people, and the book uses the example of Zach and Tony. We'll stick with those two names just to make things easier. The first and second is how Zach sees himself or how Tony sees himself. So in this example, Zach views himself as a sports star. Tony views himself as borderline genius. So that's 1 and 2. 3 and 4 is how Tony sees Zach and how Zach sees Tony. So Zach views Tony as a nerd. And then Tony views Zach as a jock. Got it? So we got how Zach sees himself, how Zach sees the other person. Then we got 5 and 6, which is how Zach thinks Tony sees him and how Tony thinks Zach sees him. So that Zach thinks Tony sees him as awesome. He thinks Tony looks up to him. Tony thinks Zach sees him as a loser. That's Barnland's six-person concept. You're trying to determine perceptions there. You're working, instead of just with 1 or 2 people, you're working with 6 or more. Well, then we've got the next thing, which is the +2 concept. And that is how Zach thinks Tony sees himself and how Tony thinks Zach sees himself. So in this, back to the same example, Zach thinks Tony sees himself as the next Bill Gates, whereas Tony thinks Zach sees himself as God's gift to everybody. Clear as mud? Good. Some of the barriers that are there, that are in place to an accurate self-concept, is the reflection of appraisal from others. Back to Barnland's, we see that we're talking about how somebody thinks they see us or how we think they're. So when we see somebody thinking we're a loser, it can affect our self-concept and our self-esteem and our self-image, and we can start becoming that loser. So the reflection of appraisal of others affects it. Resistance to change. I range in weight from, I've been as low as 167, and I've been as high as 100 or 275 pounds. So I've got this weight range. If I'm not careful, I tend to run about 230, 240 on a normal basis. And for a 5'9" person with fairly small bones, that's fat. It's actually morbidly obese according to the BMI, but we won't even worry about that concept. Anyway, so even when I went on a diet, I actually got down to 167. I looked rather sickly. I was gaunt. My thin looking. I still saw myself as fat. Currently, I'm running about 208, 205, 42 coat, not too bad size. Still think I'm a fat guy. So, as I said, your perception of yourself is very resistant to change. It also involves a self-serving bias. And what I mean by that is that it's that bias is the whole notion that you skew one way or the other. Self-serving means you skew to help yourself. Therefore, if I take a test and I do well on the test, it's because I'm smart and I studied hard and everything was good and all that. If I do wrong on the test or I do bad on the test, it's not my fault. It's the teacher. It's a bad trick question. It wasn't worded right. They didn't give me enough time to answer. We didn't cover that in class. Whatever. That's the notion of self-serving bias. And it also has this self-fulfilling prophecy. If I walk into a test thinking, I'm going to ace the test, there's a good possibility that positive attitude is going to reflect in my ability to take the test, and therefore I will do better on the test. Whereas if I walk in thinking, I bombed it, I'm going to bomb it, it's going to be horrible, there's a very good possibility I'm going to second guess myself, I'm going to change my attitude, and I'm going to end up doing poorly on the test. That's the notion of a self-fulfilling prophecy. It also clings to stagnant thinking, and this refers back to the resistance to change. Not only is it resistant to change, it's kind of stuck in a rut. This is the way it's going, so that's the way I'm going to continue thinking that way. It's also affected by your self-concept is also affected by self-talk. This is the notion that we're sitting there thinking to ourselves, we're talking to ourselves, telling ourselves this, telling ourselves that. We all hold some kind of basic conversation in our heads at one point or another. Some of us more so than others, but that's all right. That's beside the point. I do answer myself, but I digress. Anyway, so as you tell yourself you are doing good or you are doing bad, that will actually change your self-image and your self-concept to match what your self-talk is. You can talk yourself up, you can talk yourself down. So overall, you can do that. Now, one of the other things is that self-concept and your impression management can create ethical issues. And when I say impression management, I mean how you project yourself outward. What you do, how you show yourself, how you present yourself to the world. If you present yourself calm, cool, and collected, and you're not, that's the change, and that's self-concept, and it can create ethical issues. Mostly it's not, but take the notion of playing pool. If you've never heard of hustling or you don't know exactly what that is, let me give you the short tutorial of that. You go into a pool hall, you walk in, you start playing people, and you lose badly. You scratch on a regular basis. You don't sink anything. And then you start betting. You might get a little bit better, but just enough to fake up some self-confidence. And then you start betting, and you'll lose intentionally. And you'll lose, $5, $10, $20, $30. And then you start getting a little more cocky, like, oh, I can do better. And then you come back and you bet big. And of course, they're thinking, that's like taking money from a baby or candy from a baby. And they match your money. And all of a sudden, those $10, $20, $30 bets just jumped up to like $200, $300. They're thinking, I got this made. And then you run the table because you're a pool shark. So the reality of it is, that's the idea of your self-concept and your impression management creating an ethical issue. You project one thing even though it's something else. Now, how does perception and others come into play? As we all know, you have that thing that's the first impression. You've all probably heard the saying that you can never get a second chance to make a first impression. And technically that's true. I mean, once you've made an impression, you can't do it again. There's no do-overs. Well, if you meet me today and you meet me in 6 months, there might be a do-over because I probably won't remember you. My memory's not that great. So if you're dealing with an Alzheimer's patient or you're dealing with someone that just has bad short-term memory, you might get a second chance at a first impression. Generally speaking, not so much. We all probably know those people that we met the first day or first time, and that what we saw them as that time stuck. I walk into class, my first day of class, I walk in wearing a suit and tie. You're going to see me as the suit and tie wearing guy. I can do that for 2 or 3 times or whatever, even just the first time, and I show up in jeans and a t-shirt from then on. Doesn't matter. You're still going to look back at me as, oh, yeah, he wore a suit. As long as I check it occasionally. If you make a bad first impression, you can always make those changes, but it takes like 7 to 10 other interactions to actually overcome it. So let's go with that. I come in with a suit and tie my first day of class. Everybody looks at me the way they do. You interpret it however you want to interpret that. Then I show up in jeans and a t-shirt the next 10 times. Pretty soon you're going to forget about that suit and tie, and I'm the guy that shows up in jeans and t-shirts. As long as I don't show up in a suit and tie again, I can actually change that impression. If I show up in that suit and tie again, you're going to go back to where you were thinking before. Okay? So it's always good to pay attention. You never know when you're going to meet people, so you need to be on guard so you understand what your first impression may be and what you're going to do. Now, we touched on this last chapter, and that's stereotyping. Stereotyping is good and bad. Stereotyping is a tool. When we go to meet people, when we reach out to meet people, when we come up and we see someone from afar and we start walking up, we have very limited amount of data about that person. So we fill in the gaps with our stereotype. Where stereotypes go wrong is when we no longer allow those, when they become fixed and we stick with that, irrelevant of proof to the contrary. So when we discuss stereotyping, the name itself has a negative connotation. But in communications, it is just simply that tool, that overlay that you use to get you past the hump to where you can learn. Your stereotype should be ever changing as you become more consistent, and that kind of ties into that perceptual constancy. As we see things, as things happen throughout time, and as we run into these, we tend to react the same, or we expect the same reaction or the same consequence. So if I see someone that comes in tattooed and piercing and he is a real jerk and been whatever, the next one I see that's tattooed and pierced, I will probably automatically perpetuate that constancy. I'll try to make that perception stay the same. And where we run into trouble is where we don't allow that to change accordingly. As we get the real facts, as we change those perceptions, as those things alter and change, our perception should be changing along with them. Fundamental attribution error, we'll touch on this for just a bit. It's the notion that we assign cause to a certain attribute or a certain stigma or whatever, not stigma, a certain thing that someone does. So if I see someone who is on their phone and not paying attention to me, and they're 20-somethings, I'm going to assume with your generation that you're just that person that stays on the phone all the time. The reality of it is you may be a person that doesn't use the phone hardly at all, and I just happened to see you the one time you were on the phone. That's the error. I take the generation, take the stereotype of always on a phone, and then I attribute that to your action going on at the time. Any of you who have ever discussed or dealt or watched or show or seen anything that has to do with psychoanalyzing, you've probably heard of projection. You're projecting on you others. I have this negative feeling about myself. I'm fat. I'm going to, and I overeat because I'm lazy and I just don't want to deal with not overeating. So I project that onto you. Because you're fat, that must be the same reason. Has nothing to do with that you have a thyroid condition and you literally can't burn off the calories. Now, developing your perpetual skills, your perceptional skills. To improve your self-concept. One of the reasons why you want to do this, you want to be aware that you want to pay attention to your self-reflection. You want to look back on your self-talk. You want to really look at what you're doing. If you don't know it exists, it's hard to pay attention to it. Now that we've covered some of this in class, you'll start looking at this and you'll start realizing that, yeah, I'm doing some self-talk and I'm negative. I'm talking to myself negatively and that's affecting my self-concept. But if I want to improve it, I need to check that. I need to watch those self-serving biases. If I see that, I did good because of the test or I did bad, fine. But try to change things. Pay attention. That will help improve your self-concept. Avoid those self-fulfilling prophecies. Well, I say avoid them, but the reality of it is that you can use it to a benefit. But it's being there and being beneficial. And then, of course, the irrational beliefs, you want to reflect on that and make sure that what makes sense makes sense. The next one is seek feedback. The trick to seeking feedback, though, and the thing you got to be careful about this is to be sure that those that you're seeking feedback are going to be honest and truthful and not just out to be hateful, or they're going to lie to you about something just because. So seek feedback and check yourself to keep your self-concept improving. Now, to improve your thing with others, your perception of others, you need to be mindful. You need to pay attention to everything that's going on about you. You need to really be in there on it. The next thing is reframing. We will spend a lot more time on this later in class when we start talking about listening skills. And then, of course, when we do our mediation role plays and some of those, we will get into reframing a little more. The basic concept of reframing, though, the whole notion behind it, is that you are seeing the world through this little picture frame, this little window. And you see through this window and this window alone. By reframing, you're looking through somebody else's window or some other angle. So you want to reframe things to understand it from their perspective, their point of view. That's the notion of reframing. And then you have perception checking. This is very, very, very important. Anytime you make an assumption, all your perceptions are based on assumptions. Anytime you make an assumption and then you build on that assumption and you build higher on that assumption, you build higher, you work up that ladder of inference, and eventually the further up you get, the more shaky that gets. Check your perceptions. I'm not saying they're wrong, but just verify that they are not. So again, be mindful of what's going on, reframe to make sure you're seeing what they're seeing, and then check your perception to make sure what you're seeing is actually truthful.